Gerda stops in a garden and kind of stays there for months. Doesn't really realize it. This is a fairly common trope that shows up in stories. I'm sure I've mentioned it before. Brigadoon is a classic example of this. It was made into a musical where people go into this hidden town that just disappears for hundreds of years at a time. Fairy circles, which I know I've mentioned before, are another classic example of this, where people go into this hidden land and they just disappear for months and then they reappear. So that's kind of what happened to little Gerda. And there's some interesting things in here that tie into some of the other stories that I've done. So, for instance, the story of the tiger lily. The tiger lily told a story about a Hindu bride who was on her husband's funeral pyre. And we talked about this back at Around the World in 80 Days, where Phileas Fogg stumbled upon this in him, and Passepartout broke it up and stole the woman away so that, she wouldn't have to die, because honestly, she didn't really want to die. So, anyway, so we talked about that one happening before. But the flowers talking, this is just like out of Alice in Wonderland. Or actually, sorry, Through the Looking Glass. Because in Through the Looking Glass, in the Looking Glass world, Alice went into the garden and she was talking with the flowers, and the flowers were talking and telling their own silly little stories. So this kind of ties back into this. Now, one of the things that they mentioned in the last book, and sorry, in the last story of the Snow Queen, and in this one, was the town gate. Now, way back when there were wars all over the place and towns were fighting towns, most towns had this city wall. And there was a wall built all the way around the town. And if you wanted to get into the city, you would have to go in through the gate. And there was no sneaking into the city. If you were an invading army, you would have to climb over the wall or break down the wall or break down the gate. And this was how warfare was done back in the day. Because, when people would go to war, you pull all the people in, all the supplies in, and you just sit and wait, and you had a little siege. But that's the way that towns were. And then after a while, after enough peace, towns built up outside of walls. So if you're to take a look at many of the ancient cities, I mean, ancient, we're talking thousands of years old. Actually, London is an example of this. Jerusalem is an example of this, where you have the city wall actually inside of the city. So if you're to take a look at Jerusalem, there are bits of the old city wall from Roman times and before. So you have these bits of the old city wall that are in the middle of downtown. I mean, it's just the same thing with London. London was an ancient Roman city. The Romans built London, and they built a fortress, and they built a little city, and they built walls around the city. And that's how they kept out the Scots and the Picts and the Anglos and the Angles and the Saxons. And that's how the Romans kept those people out. And, they built a wall around the city. Well, eventually the city grew as the Roman army grew. And so you have this city in the middle of London, which is like these ancient Roman walls. And it's like, it's in the middle of the town. It's like, what good are walls there? Well, it's like the town used to be a lot smaller. So all of these towns had their own little gates. And in this case, the river doesn't run through the gates. And there's advantages and disadvantages both ways. Advantages, you have water. Disadvantages, you can be invaded by water. And there have been one of the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, I can't remember which one, had a river, had a gate, or not a gate, had a wall, kind of, that ran through the river. So I think it was the Tigris. It may have been the Euphrates, but one of the two big rivers in Mesopotamia. And they built a city in the river. They had the wall going through the river. And that one lasted until the Mongols. And the Mongols had a hate for this city because, well, they thought, no, rude to ambassadors and things like that. And the Mongols were like, fine. And, burned it and killed everybody. But anyway, so there's advantages and disadvantages. But anyway, towns used to all have walls and gates. And yeah, it's kind of cool. But that is story 3.